When Emma's father passes away, she is devastated to learn that her entire inheritance, her family's home, business, and savings, has been left solely to her older brother, Ethan. Confused and betrayed, Emma confronts Ethan, only to uncover his smug confession: he manipulated their father into changing the will, believing Emma was too soft to handle the family legacy. Determined to fight back, Emma begins to expose Ethan's shady dealings, uncovering a web of corruption and greed that is dragging their father's business into ruin. As she builds her own rival company from scratch, Emma topples Ethan's empire, piece by piece, until he loses everything. But just when Emma thinks she's won, Ethan drops a bombshell: their father had a shocking reason for rewriting the will, one tied to a long-buried family secret. As Emma digs deeper, she discovers the truth about her brother's origins, a revelation that flips everything she thought she knew about her family upside down. With betrayal, revenge, and scandal at every turn, Emma must decide: will she use this newfound power to destroy Ethan once and for all, or will she finally let go of her thirst for vengeance? The truth might just destroy them both. It all started with a knock on my door. A sound so mundane, yet it would change the course of my life forever. I was in the middle of organizing old photo albums, something I often did when I missed my dad. He'd passed away a month earlier, and I was still grappling with the loss. Grief has a way of making time feel heavy, like every second stretches endlessly. That knock was the last thing I expected to interrupt my quiet evening. When I opened the door, a man in a gray suit stood before me. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and a somber expression on his face. "Are you Emma Sullivan?" he asked. "Yes," I replied hesitantly. "I'm Nathan Carter," he said, extending his hand. "I was your father's attorney. May I come in?" My heart tightened. I stepped aside, and he walked in, clutching a folder he had pulled from his briefcase. He sat down at my kitchen table, and I followed, my hands shaking slightly. This had to be about Dad's will. We'd discussed it before, so I thought I knew what to expect. The house, the business, and the savings account were supposed to be split equally between my brother Ethan and me. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the security, the legacy Dad had promised both of us. But as Mr. Carter began speaking, the pit in my stomach grew. "Your father revised his will 3 weeks before his passing," he said, sliding a document across the table toward me. "He left everything to your brother, Ethan. The house, the business, and all liquid assets." "I'm sorry." The words didn't register at first. I stared at the paper in front of me, unable to comprehend what I was looking at. My eyes skimmed over the formal language, searching desperately for an explanation. This doesn't make sense," I stammered. "Dad told me, he told me everything would be split. Why would he change it? Why would he leave me nothing?" Mr. Carter's face softened, but his tone remained professional. "I'm not privy to the personal reasons behind your father's decision, but the will is legally binding. Ethan was named the sole beneficiary." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. How could Dad do this to me? We'd been so close. He'd always said I'd be taken care of, that I'd never have to worry. And Ethan, why hadn't he told me? Surely he knew about this. Did Ethan know? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't say for certain," Mr. Carter replied, standing up to leave. "But I recommend you speak with him directly." After he left, I sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the document in front of me. The grief I'd been feeling for weeks suddenly morphed into something darker: betrayal, anger, confusion. None of this made sense. Dad and I had talked so often, shared so many moments. Why would he shut me out like this? I called Ethan that night, my hands trembling as I held the phone. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. And again. By the third call, I was pacing around my living room, fury bubbling just under the surface. He didn't pick up. The next day, I called again. Still nothing. I texted him, asking him to call me back, but there was no response. For 3 days, I reached out, each attempt ignored. It was unlike Ethan to be this elusive. And the longer he stayed silent, the more suspicious I became. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them over the phone. That's when I decided to drive to his house. Ethan lived about 45 minutes away in a sprawling suburban neighborhood, his house a newly renovated monstrosity that screamed money. I pulled into his driveway late in the afternoon, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't even bother knocking, I pounded on the door until he opened it. He looked surprised to see me, but not guilty. That's what struck me first, he didn't look like a man who had stolen something. He looked smug, like he'd been waiting for me. "Emma," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What brings you here?" "You know why I'm here," I snapped, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. "I found out about the will." "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I didn't think it was my place." "That was Dad's decision." "Don't give me that crap," I shot back. "Dad wouldn't do something like this. Not without being manipulated." "What did you say to him? What lies did you tell him?" Ethan's expression darkened for a moment, but then he shrugged, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I didn't tell him any lies. I just helped him see things clearly. Dad needed someone strong to manage the business, the estate. Let's be honest, Emma, you're too emotional. Too soft." He knew I was the better choice. His words hit me like a slap to the face. I stared at him, my breath caught in my throat. "You're unbelievable," I whispered. "You've always been a selfish prick, but this is a new low." Ethan laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Spare me the moral outrage. The will is ironclad, Emma. There's nothing you can do about it." I wanted to scream, to hit him, to make him understand how deeply he'd hurt me. But I didn't. I just turned around and walked back to my car, my chest heaving with rage. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. As I drove home, tears streamed down my face. This wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about trust. Ethan was my brother, the person I'd grown up with, the person Dad had always told me to rely on. And he'd betrayed me in the worst possible way. But if Ethan thought I was going to roll over and accept this, he was dead wrong. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to make him pay. I didn't sleep much after my confrontation with Ethan. I spent the entire night pacing my apartment, replaying his smug expression over and over in my mind. Every word he said echoed like a cruel joke. "You're too emotional. Too soft. How dare he? He didn't just steal my inheritance, he stole my father's trust in me, manipulated it for his own gain. He didn't even have the decency to feel ashamed." By sunrise, my sadness had hardened into something else. I couldn't explain it, but a cold, determined energy started coursing through me. I wasn't just going to sit back and let him get away with this. Ethan wanted to play dirty. Fine. I'd beat him at his own game. For the next few days, I buried myself in research. I knew Ethan was arrogant, he always had been. He loved to flaunt his success, and he loved taking risks. But that kind of arrogance always left a trail of mistakes. All I had to do was find them. I started small, scrolling through his social media accounts, reading every post, every photo caption. Ethan had always been careful to present himself as this polished, successful businessman. But the cracks in his facade were there, if you looked hard enough. The first clue came from an Instagram post. It was from 6 months ago, a picture of Ethan standing next to a sleek sports car, holding up a set of keys with a cocky grin. The caption read, "Dream car. Hard work pays off." It looked impressive at first glance, but I knew Ethan. I knew he wasn't the kind of guy to save for something like that. He liked instant gratification. That car wasn't bought with hard work, it was probably bought with borrowed money. I started looking into his business next. Ethan had taken over the family construction company when Dad got sick a few years ago. At the time, it seemed like the obvious choice. Ethan was good at talking big and charming people into trusting him. But I remembered how Dad used to complain about Ethan's reckless decisions, underbidding contracts, cutting corners with suppliers. Dad had always managed to keep things afloat, but Ethan didn't have his experience or discipline. If he was running the company into the ground, I was going to find out. I made a few calls to some of the suppliers Dad used to work with. At first, I wasn't sure they'd talk to me. After all, Ethan was technically their client now. But it turned out my father's reputation was stronger than I realized. Most of them were happy to speak with me, especially once I explained what was going on. What I learned was worse than I expected. Ethan hadn't just been cutting corners, he'd been burning bridges. Several suppliers told me he'd stopped paying invoices on time, sometimes not at all. Others said he demanded steep discounts, promising bigger contracts that never materialized. One supplier even told me Ethan had threatened to switch to a cheaper competitor unless they gave him what he wanted. It was clear he didn't care about the long-term consequences. He was only interested in squeezing as much profit as he could, no matter who he hurt in the process. I wasn't surprised, but I was disgusted. This was our father's business, the one he'd spent decades building from the ground up. And Ethan was treating it like his personal piggy bank. The real breakthrough came when I looked into the company's financial records. I didn't have direct access, of course, but there were ways to get a glimpse of what was going on. I started with public records, loan filings, tax liens, anything that might hint at trouble. And trouble was exactly what I found. Ethan had taken out several large loans in the past 2 years, far more than the business could reasonably support. The interest alone would have been enough to cripple the company, but he hadn't stopped there. He'd also used the business as collateral for a massive personal line of credit. It wasn't hard to guess what he'd spent it on: cars, vacations, that giant house of his. He was living way beyond his means, and the business was paying the price. The more I uncovered, the angrier I got. Ethan wasn't just a thief, he was a ticking time bomb. If he kept going like this, the company would collapse, and he'd drag Dad's entire legacy down with him. I couldn't let that happen. But I also knew I couldn't just confront him again. Ethan wouldn't admit to anything, and even if he did, he wouldn't stop. He'd spent his whole life getting away with things because no one ever held him accountable. That was about to change. The first step in my plan was to shine a light on Ethan's shady dealings. I reached out to a journalist I'd met a few years ago, back when I worked in public relations. Her name was Sarah, and she had a reputation for digging deep into local corruption. When I told her what I'd found, she was immediately interested. "This could be huge," she said during our first phone call. "But I'll need more than just what you've told me. Do you have any documents? Emails? Proof of what he's been doing?" "I can get it," I promised. It wasn't easy. Ethan wasn't stupid, he didn't leave a paper trail lying around for anyone to find. But he wasn't as careful as he thought he was, either. Using the information I'd already gathered, I started piecing together a timeline of his financial mismanagement. I even managed to get copies of a few overdue invoices from the suppliers I'd spoken to. It wasn't a complete picture, but it was enough for Sarah to start her investigation. While Sarah worked on the story, I turned my attention to the suppliers. I knew they were angry with Ethan, but anger wasn't enough. I needed them on my side. I started making calls again, this time with a proposition. I told them I was planning to start my own construction company, one that would compete directly with Ethan's. I promised them fair treatment, timely payments, and a chance to get back at the man who'd screwed them over. Most of them were hesitant at first. After all, I didn't have much money or experience. But they hated Ethan more than they doubted me. One by one, they agreed to give me a chance. It was risky, and I knew it. Starting a business from scratch wasn't going to be easy, especially with limited resources. But I wasn't doing this just for myself. I was doing it for Dad, for the suppliers Ethan had betrayed, for everyone who'd been hurt by his greed. And most of all, I was doing it to prove to Ethan that I wasn't too emotional or too soft. I was stronger than he thought, and I wasn't going to let him win. By the time Sarah's article was published, I was ready for the fallout. The exposé was brutal, a detailed account of Ethan's shady practices, complete with statements from former employees and suppliers. It painted a picture of a man who cared more about his own wealth than his company, his family, or his reputation. The story spread quickly, and the backlash was immediate. Clients started pulling their contracts, suppliers began demanding payment, and investors were nowhere to be found. Ethan's carefully constructed image was crumbling, and I was just getting started. The morning after Sarah's article was published, I could almost feel the shift in the air. Ethan's name was everywhere, on social media, in local business forums, even in group chats between industry professionals. People were finally seeing him for what he really was, a fraud. And for the first time since all this began, I felt a flicker of hope. But I knew this was just the beginning. Exposing Ethan wasn't enough to bring him down completely. If he thought he could weather the storm, he would. He'd charm his way back into people's good graces, make false promises, and move on like nothing had happened. That was the thing about Ethan, he was a survivor, in the most selfish way possible. He'd trample over anyone and anything to protect himself. If I was going to stop him, I had to hit him where it hurt, his wallet. It was time to make my move. My first priority was to get my new business off the ground. I didn't have a fancy office or a big budget, but I had something far more valuable: trust. The suppliers I'd spoken to had agreed to work with me, and they were willing to cut me deals on materials to help me get started. They wanted Ethan out of the picture as much as I did. With their help, I was able to secure a few small contracts, nothing major, but enough to prove I was serious. At the same time, I kept a close eye on Ethan's company. The fallout from Sarah's article was worse than even I had anticipated. Clients were pulling out faster than he could replace them, leaving half-finished projects and unpaid invoices in their wake. Suppliers were refusing to deliver materials until they were paid up front, which Ethan couldn't afford. Lawsuits from former employees started piling up, each one alleging unfair treatment, withheld wages, or outright fraud. Ethan's once thriving company was spiraling, and everyone could see it. But instead of scaling back, he doubled down. He started slashing budgets, cutting corners even more aggressively than before. He stopped paying rent on his office space, moved into a smaller building, and fired half his staff. He even put his house on the market, though he tried to spin it as a strategic downsizing when people asked. But the cracks were too big to hide. I watched it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was the same business my father had spent decades building, the same business he'd poured his heart and soul into. Seeing it fall apart was painful, but I knew it was necessary. Ethan didn't deserve to carry on Dad's legacy. If anything, Dad would have been ashamed of what Ethan had turned it into. Then came the final blow. It was late one evening when I got a call from one of the suppliers I'd been working with. His name was Tom, and he'd been one of Dad's most loyal partners for years. "Emma," he said, his voice crackling over the phone, "I just got a call from Ethan. He's desperate. He offered me a huge discount if I'd agree to start delivering to him again." I felt a surge of anger. Ethan had some nerve, going back to the same people he'd burned, pretending like nothing had happened. "What did you say?" I asked. Tom chuckled. "I told him to take a hike. But that's not why I'm calling. He's desperate because his biggest client just dropped him. A big commercial contract, some apartment complex downtown. They're looking for a new contractor. I thought maybe you'd want to take a shot at it." My heart skipped a beat. This was it, the opportunity I'd been waiting for. If I could land this contract, it would put my new business on the map. It wouldn't just hurt Ethan financially, it would take away one of the few lifelines he had left. Send me the details, I told Tom. I'll make sure they know I'm interested. The next few days were a whirlwind. I put together a proposal, showcasing everything I could offer, reliable suppliers, fair pricing, and a commitment to quality that Ethan had never cared about. I reached out to the project manager, a woman named Linda, and set up a meeting to pitch my company. I was nervous, but I was also determined. I didn't have Ethan's slick charm or his years of experience, but I had something he didn't: integrity. I told Linda the truth about who I was, where I came from, and why I was so passionate about this business. I didn't badmouth Ethan directly, but I didn't have to. His reputation spoke for itself. When Linda called me a week later to tell me I'd gotten the contract, I nearly cried. It was the break I needed, the proof that all my hard work was starting to pay off. But the real satisfaction came when I heard about Ethan's reaction. Word got back to me through Tom and a few others in the industry. Apparently, Ethan had been counting on that contract to keep his business afloat. When he found out I'd landed it instead, he lost it. He called Linda, yelling and accusing her of sabotaging him. She hung up on him. The thought of Ethan's rage should have scared me, but it didn't. If anything, it motivated me. For years, he'd been the golden boy, the one who always got his way, no matter who he hurt. Now, for the first time in his life, he was facing the consequences of his actions. And I wasn't done yet. With the new contract secured, my business began to grow. More suppliers and clients started reaching out, eager to work with someone who wasn't tainted by scandal. Ethan's company, meanwhile, was collapsing under the weight of its own mismanagement. By the end of the year, he declared bankruptcy. The family business, the one Dad had spent his entire life building, was gone. I thought I'd feel triumphant when it happened. But as I watched the news coverage of the bankruptcy auction, my heart ached. Ethan had done this to himself, but it still felt like a loss. Dad's name, his legacy, his hard work, it had all been destroyed because Ethan couldn't see beyond his own greed. Still, I couldn't let myself dwell on it. I had a business to run, employees to support, and a future to build. Ethan might have taken my inheritance, but he hadn't taken my drive. If anything, he'd only made me stronger. But I knew I wasn't finished with him yet. Ethan had lost the business, the house, and his reputation, but he still hadn't acknowledged what he'd done. He still hadn't admitted that he betrayed me, betrayed Dad, and betrayed everyone who had ever trusted him. And I wasn't going to stop until he did. Ethan was broken, or so I thought. After the bankruptcy auction, where I watched strangers pick apart the pieces of his once grand life, I assumed it was over. I assumed he'd crawl into some hole, lick his wounds, and disappear. But Ethan wasn't someone who knew how to stay down. He was a cockroach, and cockroaches always find a way to survive. The first sign of trouble came 2 months after the auction. I had just wrapped up my first major project, the downtown apartment complex Ethan had been banking on, and things were finally settling into place. My business was gaining momentum, I had a steady stream of contracts lined up, and for the first time in years, I felt stable. That's when I got a call from one of my suppliers, Tom. "Emma," he began, his voice low, hesitant. "We need to talk." "What's going on?" I asked, immediately on edge. "It's Ethan," he said. "He's been sniffing around. He's trying to start a new business, construction, just like before." I almost laughed. "With what money?" "He lost everything." "Not everything," Tom said gravely. "Apparently, he had some hidden accounts. Offshore. Enough to start rebuilding. And get this, he's telling people you sabotaged him." I froze. My grip on the phone tightened. "He's what?" He's telling anyone who'll listen that you ruined the family business, that you spread lies about him to steal his contracts. A few people are buying it, Emma. He's saying you betrayed your own brother. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind raced with anger, disbelief, and something else, fear. Ethan wasn't just rebuilding, he was trying to rewrite the narrative. If enough people believed his lies, he could undermine everything I'd worked so hard to build. He could twist the truth until I was the villain and he was the victim. But what really chilled me wasn't the idea of Ethan spreading rumors. It was the realization that he wasn't done with me. Ethan didn't just want to recover. He wanted revenge. I decided I needed to see him face to face. If Ethan wanted a fight, fine. But I wasn't going to let him operate in the shadows, spreading lies unchecked. I wanted answers, about his so-called offshore accounts, about his plans, about how far he was willing to go. I found him at a bar downtown. It was a place he used to frequent back when he was still riding high, back when his name carried weight. Now, it felt almost pathetic seeing him there, nursing a drink at the corner of the bar like he was still trying to hold on to a piece of his old life. When I walked in, his eyes flicked up to meet mine. For a moment, I saw something unfamiliar flash across his face, maybe regret, maybe shame. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same arrogant smirk I'd grown to despise. Well, he drawled, leaning back in his chair. If it isn't the golden girl herself. Come to gloat. I'm not here to gloat, I said, keeping my voice steady. I'm here to find out what the hell you think you're doing. Ethan chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. What I'm doing? Oh, you mean picking up the pieces of my life after you destroyed it? Don't play the victim, Ethan, I snapped. You did this to yourself. You manipulated Dad, you stole my inheritance, and you ran the company into the ground. If anything, I cleaned up your mess. He leaned forward, his smirk fading. You think you're so righteous, don't you? But let's not pretend you're some saint. You went after me, Emma. You didn't just want justice, you wanted to ruin me. You ruined yourself, I shot back. I just made sure people saw the truth. Ethan laughed bitterly. Truth? You wouldn't know the truth if it slapped you in the face. Dad chose me, Emma. He knew you couldn't handle the business, so he left it to me. You couldn't stand that, could you? That's why you went behind my back and tore everything apart. I was done arguing. Enough with the lies, Ethan. I know about the offshore accounts. I know you've been trying to start over. But if you come after me, if you try to destroy what I've built, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. Ethan's face darkened. He set his drink down and stared at me, his voice low and dangerous. You don't know everything, Emma. You think you've won, but you're just as blind as Dad was. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I asked. He leaned back, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Did you ever wonder why Dad changed the will? Why he cut you out completely? My heart skipped a beat. He didn't cut me out. You manipulated him. Ethan shook his head, chuckling to himself. No, Emma. I didn't have to manipulate him. He changed the will because of you. Because he found out what you did. I felt a cold wave wash over me. What are you talking about? Ethan stood up, tossing a few bills onto the bar. Ask Mom's old lawyer, he said, brushing past me. Ask him what Dad found in her files. I grabbed his arm, stopping him. Tell me what you're talking about. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. You think you're so perfect, Emma. But Dad knew the truth. He knew about your little secret. That's why he didn't trust you. That's why he left everything to me. And just like that, he was gone, slipping out of the bar and into the night, leaving me standing there, stunned and trembling. I couldn't let it go. Ethan's words rattled around in my head for days, refusing to settle. What secret was he talking about? What could Dad have possibly found that made him change the will? I kept telling myself it was just another one of Ethan's manipulations, another way to mess with my head. But what if it wasn't? I decided to take his advice. I tracked down Mom's old lawyer, a man named Robert Hughes. He had handled her estate after she passed away, years before Dad rewrote the will. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but when I called, he agreed to meet with me. Robert was an older man, kind but reserved. When I asked him about Mom's files, he looked at me with a mixture of hesitation and pity. "Emma," he said, "are you sure you want to dig this up? Some things are better left alone." "I need to know," I insisted. "Please." He sighed and retrieved an old file from his desk. "Your mother kept this from you and Ethan, but your father found out after her death. It was a paternity test." I froze. "A paternity test?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. Robert nodded. "Your mother had an affair, Emma. It was brief, but, well, she wasn't sure if Ethan was your father's biological son. The test confirmed he wasn't." The air was sucked out of the room. My mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. "Ethan isn't Dad's son?" I whispered. "No," Robert said softly. "But your father found out after your mother passed. It devastated him, but he decided to keep it a secret, for the sake of the family. I suspect, though, that it influenced his decision to rewrite the will. He wanted Ethan to feel secure, to feel like he belonged. I think he thought he was doing the right thing." I sat there in stunned silence. Everything I thought I knew about my family had been a lie. Ethan wasn't even my father's son. And yet, Dad had left everything to him, not out of trust, but out of guilt. Ethan didn't know I'd discovered the truth, but I knew it would destroy him if he ever found out. For once, I held the power. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted revenge, or mercy.